Hello, everybody. Welcome to week two. Also, hello to the cat Mo. And now, hopefully, she will leave for the rest of the video, but probably not. But, all right, I hope everybody caught their rhythm with the first week and we understand the expectations of the course. Make sure you really clearly understand that. The discussion post requirements will be something you have to contribute to weekly. So make sure you understand what to do each week and how to complete that to get full credit. I'll go through and grade the first week discussion soon so you have an idea of what's expected and any pointers that you need to focus on in future discussions, I'll make clear in your grade there. So we're continuing the first week's lecture and getting a better understanding of early American history, specifically starting the discussion about some of our founding fathers. And let's begin. So sorry, I forgot to include a learning objective slide. But if you are curious what the learning objectives are, a great way to understand that is to go to the end of the lecture, look at the what do we learn slides, understand what's expected of you, and then come back to the beginning and let's begin. So first off, pluralism. Pluralism is a key term you'll hear frequently in political science at large, especially studying political science in the United States as we live in a pluralist system of politics. So pluralism, let's give a concrete definition. It is a theory that views politics as a conflict amongst groups in which multiple groups are vying for power in a single system of government. Think about the United States multi-party system. We have the two dominating parties, but we also have third parties. We have a wide range of perspectives that are all understood and accepted when it comes to governance. When you look at pluralist systems of governance, you see it tends to be majority rule with minority protections. So you have majorities obtain leadership positions, govern in their interests, but oftentimes due to the pluralist dimensions of the society and the reality of factions, you see minority protections as well, as those minority interests are appeased and in aims to maintain general cohesion among society. So in a pluralist system, you generally understand that we hold power, that power should not be concentrated into the hands of a single elite group or individual. So we see numerous policies within pluralist systems that maintain those minority protections. So now that we understand a key term that I have to hit on every so frequently, let's start talking about our founding fathers. And I remember when I was teaching this course at the University of Montana, I was acting as a teacher's assistant during grad school, and I would grade some quizzes and finals. And the thing that drove me crazy was how many people mixed up Samuel Adams and John Adams. Very, very different contributions to American history. So first off, Samuel Adams. Known as the father of the Revolution, he mobilized Americans to throw tea into the Boston Harbor in a pivotal moment in U.S. history. We also remember the Boston massacres. He mobilized a lot of those individuals to lead that protest. And among historians, he's known as one of the great propagandists of early American history, as he was a great author and writer and wrote very persuasive articles encouraging the revolution, was a leading actor in the revolutionary period of American history. A lot of his sentiments were in backlash to the taxation policies that were existing in the United States. We see the Tea Act of 1773 and just the general sentiment around taxation without representation came from the sentiments of Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams did not maintain positions within the United States federal government, but did align with the Anti-Federalists and significantly contributed to a lot of the early American debate and was a significant representative. He was the Secretary of State for the state of Massachusetts until John Hancock, somebody we may know quite well, ousted him from the role right after, just weeks after, John Adams, his second cousin, and James Bowdoin, I forget how to pronounce his name all the time, wrote the state's constitution themselves. So after that, he later acted as the lieutenant governor and eventually governor of the state of Massachusetts and defended adamantly state sovereignty throughout his professional career. But eventually, once the United States was concretely founded after the Articles and after the implementation of the U.S. Constitution, we see, I mean, even during the Articles, actually, we see him become a defender of Union support and maintaining the Union as the main goal that should be maintained at the time. Now, we also noticed he's a representative from Massachusetts. What else happened in Massachusetts? Well, we remember Shays' Rebellion, the Farmers' Rebellion in Massachusetts occurred. Now, what did Samuel Adams have to say about Shays' Rebellion? The rebellion that revealed the weaknesses of our central government and the need for the Constitutional Convention, which eventually led to the strengthening of the state and the creation of the U.S. Constitution. Well, what did he have to say about this? He was cited stating, quote, "In monarchies, the crime of treason and rebellion may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death." So you see that adamant defense in certain regimes of the ability to rebel against a tyrannical government. But if you live in a republic, well, you ought to follow the laws of the majority and hope that there are minority interests being appeased to. So, revolutionary Samuel Adams. We have to remember him concretely as a defender of the revolution, father of the revolution, not defender, father of the revolution, and defender of sovereignty at the time, aligning with the Anti-Federalists, a collective we will look more into more detail on in just a few slides. Oh, that didn't work. So let's talk about his second cousin, the more impactful, I guess you could say, more impactful, especially when the United States was formed, individual, John Adams. I refer to him as Judicial John Adams because it helps us remember his contributions. Why is he Judicial John Adams? Because he represented the British soldiers in court after the Boston Massacre, among many other practices. He later became the second vice president under the first vice president, and the second president of the United States, vice president under George Washington. He was also a delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1774 prior to the U.S. Constitution, representing Massachusetts. He was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress as well, chairman to the Board of War and Ordnance during 1776, eventually became a diplomat to France, a period of maybe disdain in his career, which eventually peaked when he was the commissioner for the Treaty of Paris, working alongside Benjamin Franklin, but oftentimes not getting the credit that Benjamin Franklin was obtaining in France. And that is why he was happy to leave and become briefly the diplomat to the Dutch Republic, and then eventually, where he was most productive, briefly serving as the minister to the Netherlands, also served very productively as the minister to Great Britain, helped solidifying a lot of our ties with Great Britain after the Revolution and providing a peaceful roadmap for alliances. We also see, of course, as we see right here, he was the vice president and then president. So why do we talk about John Adams? One, we do have to adamantly remember, as I just stated, he represented the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, which at a time, there was blood being spent in the streets. There was a French Revolution happening almost simultaneously, and the kings were being beheaded. These were low-level individuals in the eyes of the American public that were acting as opposition to their liberty and freedom. And it was not uncommon to hear the sentiments that they should be hung for their actions. But John Adams adamantly defended the belief that we need fair court procedures for all who exist in the United States, not just those who we defend among the public. So breaking precedent with the time and creating fair court procedures, which will eventually be implemented in our Bill of Rights and be a pivotal part of American judicial systems. So we have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Briefly mention them. I talk about John Adams representing the Federalist divide and Samuel Adams, the revolutionary older second cousin, representing the Anti-Federalists. So what are these two collectives? Are they even political parties? Well, first, we have to know that they are not political parties. The Federalists eventually will become a political party, but the Anti-Federalists will not. At the moment, during the Constitutional Convention, as we briefly mentioned last week, we see this divide arise as we are debating our Constitution. So this divide stems from the debate around the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. The Federalists want the Constitution to be ratified, and the Anti-Federalists, fearful of state sovereignty being trampled by this new strengthened central government, do not want the U.S. Constitution to be ratified, at least as is. So what follows is a process of individuals writing about their beliefs and advocating to the general public and those who have persuasive powers in early American politics. So we see the creation of the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. So Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Before we talk about how they presented their opinions and views, let's briefly talk about what their views are. So the Federalists, their overarching conflict here is the size and strength of the central government. The Federalists want a strong central government. We can see this advocated by people like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, James Madison, and our boy on Broadway, Alexander Hamilton. We also see James Madison eventually leaving the Federalist when political parties are formed in the 1790s, but we'll wait a little bit to talk about that. So the Federalists wanted a strong central government. They were predominantly urban. They were concentrated in the northeastern section of the United States at the time. Think of New York, the manufacturing hubs of early America. They supported the drafting of the Constitution and the ratification as is. They wanted a strong national military because, well, for one, we needed to be able to defend the United States if need be. So they were advocating for the strengthening of the central government overall. Now, the Anti-Federalists, the other side of the divide, voting in opposition of the U.S. Constitution during the Constitutional Convention and then aiming to not have its ratification the years following, they wanted a weak central government with strong states. Think of the Articles of Confederation. They wanted to maintain that system. I mean, the Constitutional Convention, its intentions were to strengthen the Articles and not create a new system of government. It was James Madison that went a little left field and brought proposals for the U.S. Constitution, which eventually snowballed into what we have today. Well, the Anti-Federalists would have never wanted that to happen. They are advocates for maintaining the Articles. They were predominantly rural, concentrated in the southern states, mainly slave economy states. They wanted state autonomy. They wanted the independence of each state, and were very weary of the Constitution's emphasis of a strong central government. They did not want a national military. They wanted individual states to be responsible for their own security and military. And once we did see that the Constitution was about to be ratified, we do see some of the final Anti-Federalists aligning and ratifying the Constitution with the understanding and agreement that there will be a later document ratified called the Bill of Rights. So some notable names: John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, George Mason, Thomas Jefferson. If you applied to colleges out east, almost every one of those names would be quite familiar. So let's go back to these papers that I mentioned, these publications in the local newspapers, predominantly in New York and other states in the region who were resistant to ratifying the U.S. Constitution. So there were three individuals who wrote the Federalist Papers. These individuals are John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. You may have to remember that for a quiz. And you may already remember how many Alexander Hamilton wrote because our boy on Broadway liked to sing about it a good amount. So, summarizing the Federalist Papers, all three of these individuals wrote under the pseudonym Publius. So when you look at these publications, they're not written by John Jay, Hamilton, or Madison. They're written by Publius, and we, through research, identified later on who wrote each of them. John Jay contributed 5, had to stop because he got sick. Alexander Hamilton wrote 51, the highest contributor, and James Madison was known for writing 29. Now, as they wrote these texts, you see John Jay focusing on the foreign policy and some judicial processes. He was later to become the first Supreme Court justice. Alexander Hamilton, he was a strong defender of what, if you look at last week's slide, we would call a unitary system of government. He wanted, the win oversimplified, to become another monarch. When you look at his speech at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the proposal, the Hamilton Plan he proposed, which stood as a middle ground between, not as middle ground, it was proposed in between the Virginia and New Jersey plans. We see he had extreme views for a unitary system. He wanted the president not to be referred to as a president, but as the monarch. He wanted us to look like a monarchy with a king, and this was very unpopular at the time, and it incentivized many anti-federalists to vote in opposition to the Federalist Collective. But his extreme proposal at times made James Madison's Federalist approach seem much more palatable. And James Madison wrote 29 of these Federalist Papers, presenting a more moderate, really oftentimes advocating for the system we have today, frequently defending checks and balances and the way that civil society will behave in a pluralist system of government. Some quotes from the Federalist Papers, which summarize them generally quite well. Nothing is more certain than the need for government. End quote. The people must give to the government some of their natural rights in order to provide it with power. End quote. A lot of social contract theory evident in that last quote. Week 4, I'll talk about what social contract theory is. Won't waste time doing this now. But we do understand the Federalist Papers, primarily written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They were persuasive papers, primarily published in New York and Virginia. We see some arguments within them, some quotes, like in Federalist number 45, James Madison stated, quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." So you see in these texts, they're trying to address the concerns of the anti-federalists through their publications of these texts. We do see eventually, after these publications, New York ratified the Constitution with a vote of 30 to 27 in favor. So just barely convincing enough of these individual state representatives to ratify the Constitution. And additionally, New York did require the ratification of the addition of the Bill of Rights before they agreed to ratify. Virginia eventually ratified. It was 89 to 79, a small lead of just 10. They did not directly require the Bill of Rights, although it was advocated for by some of their representatives, and eventually written by one of their representatives. Rhode Island never even sent a single delegate to the convention, which I always find fascinating, but they did eventually ratify the Constitution in 1790. They were the final state to do so, and this was actually a month after George Washington took office. So why am I mentioning all that? Because the Federalist Papers were effective in convincing those state representatives to ratify the Constitution, and specifically Virginia and New York, as they were the 10th and 11th states to ratify. Now, let's talk about some of these Federalist Papers. So Federalist Paper number 1, this proposes the discussion. It presents the question. It's written by Alexander Hamilton. He says, quote, "To decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for the political constitutions on accident and force." So in this text, you see the presentation of advocating for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. We do not want this to be luck or accident and force, which results in us having this new system of government. We instead want adamant debate and discussion, resulting in the system that we are reading about in these papers. We will read about in these papers. They continue on to state, quote, "Among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of the power." So we see an acknowledgement that there is a concentration of power, and it is those who hold power currently who we will have to convince of the strengths of this new system, of a new federal system of government. But the fact is, that we already hear it whispered in the private circles of those who oppose the new Constitution, that the 13 states are of too great extent for any general system. Now we must of necessity resort to separate confederacies of distinct portions of the whole, acknowledging the sentiments that stand in opposition to this new system of government. We have too many opinions. 13 different states with 13 different opinions and views on policies and way of life is too much to create any system of government that unites them. But this system, in which we will present in these later papers, will address this conflict. So, we see the argument for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. They argue that past systems of government were far too weak, that most significant challenges to the new Constitution are going to be the concentrations of power that already exist, and they even later address the concerns of those on the wrong side of the question, as they like to put it. And quite directly, it's summarized as, quote, as they say, quote, "Yes, my countrymen, I own to you that after having given it an attentive consideration, I am clearly of the opinion it is your interest to adopt it." Speaking of the U.S. Constitution. So we see Federalist Paper 1 presents two sides of a question and clearly identifies which side the Federalist, led by Alexander Hamilton at this time, James Madison to a line, and John Jay are on. The Federalist Paper number 10. This is a key reading in this course, as we will have to read it next week as we cover factions. This addresses the role of factions in a pluralist system of government. It's written by James Madison. We see a bit more tamed writing in this text. Throughout all of James Madison's text, you see a bit more of a policy-driven individual, where Hamilton is a little more fun to read. He's more of a, let me advocate for my policy by directly addressing your concerns, which can be a bit more abrasive. But we see James Madison's more eloquent writing, as he states, quote, "The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal disease under which popular governments have everywhere perished." Acknowledging the sentiments of the concern that public opinion, factions, and collectives tends to be the origins of the demise of many states throughout history. He continues, quote, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided, not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority." Understanding the harms that have come from overbearing majorities. But this new system, this pluralist system of government, of majority rule but with minority protections and focuses, we see that this system can be protected. But he does acknowledge the depth of this conflict that factions can bring, as he states, quote, "There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease itself. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires." So let's break that down a bit. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire. You need oxygen for an air to burn. You need liberty for factions to exist. An ailment without which it instantly expires. Without oxygen, you don't have fire. But without oxygen, you also do not have life. Without liberty, you may not have factions. But without liberty, what state do you have? He continues, "From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischief of factions. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. End quote. So right there we do see, for one, we covered it last week, the distinction between a democracy and a republic. A democracy, constant assembly, a small collective, a republic. Think of what we view as democracy today, representative democracy, in which there is a scheme of representation and electoral systems in place. And clearly expressed through these quotes, Federalist Paper 10 addresses the role of factions in early American history and how it could be a detriment to this new pluralist system of government. You will have to read this next week. Make sure you go in depth on it and answer the questions on the worksheet on Eagle Online, due at the end of next week. So let's continue. Of course, we remember James Madison's contributions, focusing a lot on the policies in the Federalist Papers. In Federalist Paper number 51, we see him focusing on the separation of the three branches of government, the system of checks and balances. So in this text, he reads, quote, the only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government, as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. He continues, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistrates should be drawn from the same fountain of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. The divisions within our government and the hopes and aims that they can act with equal power as checks over each other. The foundational view of governance, first advocated by Montesquieu, a great French judge and political theorist. Some argue that Montesquieu's first writings of separation of the three branches of government, or checks and balances, was really first just a mistranslation of a writing covering the concept of separation of church and state, which great way to look at history. Just a couple people messing up, which results in some of the greatest ideas of governance, at least us Americans would hope so. And we also see in this text, quote, in the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided into two. I already read that quote, as it's also in my notes. My bad. It's worth a double read. So we see the concept of checks and balances advocated and defended in Federalist Paper number 51. So we've talked a lot about the Federalist Papers. We remember who wrote them: James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. But we haven't spent much time on the anti-Federalist Papers because, of course, with any policy position, if you study social movements later on in political science, you'll see there is always a counter movement and a counter position. And here lies the counter position to the U.S. Constitution. And let me remind you, a position held early on in U.S. history by the vast majority of Americans. So we see these publications published in response to the Federalist Papers, written and published under the pseudonym Brutus, but it is worth noting these papers at large were far less organized. We do not have a concrete understanding of exactly who published every single Brutus publication, and there is even times in which the publications were not done under these same pseudonyms. So you see a couple other pseudonyms arising under the Anti-Federalist Papers, but generally we see these as publications advocating for the maintenance of the status quo at the time, the maintenance of the Articles of Confederation, in opposition to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Why? They feared a unitary government. They feared what Alexander Hamilton was over there dreaming and writing about all day. In this text, in some of the Federalist Papers, you see them summarizing their views as they state, quote, "The limitation of government is the surest record of the happiness of the people," end quote. In some ways, I think we all can like that at least a little bit. And another quote, "And after so recent a triumph over the British king, after blood has been spent, it is truly astonishing that a set of men among our Americans would champion a government that would destroy our liberties," identifying this new strengthened central government as a destruction of individual liberties, pointing out that we have recently triumphed and spent blood in a revolution against a British monarchy. And what, are we to just become another monarchy? So we see the divide being clear here. So we have a divide, a clear divide. We want a strong government under the Federalists. We see some authors publishing works under the pseudonym of Publius in defense of this single idea, this system of government, a federal system of government, a constitutional republic. And we see another side of the divide, the Anti-Federalists, writing in opposition, publishing under the pseudonym Brutus, advocating for state sovereignty, the maintenance of the Articles of Confederation. And this sounds a lot like current political party politics. But why is this not a political party system? Well, there are three main reasons that these two collectives do not constitute the first political party system in the United States. First, there was no campaigning for the executive branch. There was no campaigning for the office of the presidency, especially no campaigning along party lines. You'll see in just a few seconds, when we look at the elections, the way in which they voted for candidates was unlike what we see today, and there was no clear party lines, although after a couple elections we'll see the formation of party lines. So since there was no campaigning for the executive office, we can understand the second point. The executive branch was unaffected. The leader of the executive branch, our president, our first president, George Washington, as I like to call him, Old Georgie, did not align with either political party and maintained absolute neutrality. Two of his closest cabinet members, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, represented exact opposite sides of this divide, and he was able to adequately pull from each sentiment and represent a position of neutrality. So the executive office itself did not maintain a party or partisan affiliation. And finally, the third reason of why these were not political parties, the Anti-Federalists were simply an opposition group, in opposition to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. They did not have a consistent party platform. There was not a wide range of issues in which all the Anti-Federalists aligned in agreement with. They were unorganized. When they published the Brutus and the Anti-Federalist papers, they struggled to even find a consistent pseudonym to publish them under, as they did not all use Brutus. And most importantly, once the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791 occurred, the Anti-Federalists did not identify as Anti-Federalists anymore. They disbanded and dissolved as a collective immediately following the ratification, as there was no other policies for them to unite over. We see the allegiances of our founding fathers to shift during the 1790s as the political party system does, the first political party system does take shape. But it is worth noting that it is not the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So let's start talking about that first political party system in the United States. So an individual by the name Thomas Jefferson really came into the scene. Well, of course, he was already around, advocating for state sovereignty, a strong defender of Articles of Confederation and that form of governance, a advocate for localism when it comes to state rights over federal powers. We see he was even an author of the Declaration of Independence, among many other documents as well. And when we look at this collective, we use Thomas Jefferson to understand this side of the divide and the formation of the first political party system, because he was the first president representing the Democratic Republicans. Our third president, coming in right after John Adams, we'll talk about that transition briefly, representing opposite views of John Adams as he represented the Democratic Republican Party platform. So, what is this party platform? Well, they believed in state rights over federal powers. This is an offshoot of the Anti-Federalists. A lot of the Anti-Federalists are later identified very briefly after the ratification, identified as Democratic Republicans, often referred to as Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans. So they did not want a strong central government. Why did they not want a strong central government? Well, they were fearful of tyranny and authoritarianism. They were fearful of becoming another monarchy. They just, as we read in those texts, the Anti-Federalist Papers, later to develop into a lot of the Democratic Republican sentiments, they just spent blood over this revolution. And now we want to become what we just spent blood revolting against. Well, that is why they wanted a Articles of Confederation type of system of government, something that mirrored that more so than contemporary United States government. And they thought any strengthening of a central government would result in power-hungry individuals with tyrannical forms of government and closed-mindedness to the minority protections that are reliant and that a pluralist system is reliant upon. So they wanted power concentrated in the states. They wanted a confederal or federal system of governance and nothing that looked anything like a unitary system. They did this because they feared becoming another monarchy like Britain. And the best way to ensure that this is what occurs is through strictly interpreting our Constitution. Because remember, our Constitution, as we've defined a republic, it is what defines and restricts a state. So the Constitution is basically the laws that the new central government must follow. It's not granting them abilities, instead it's restricting them at countless times. So this Constitution that restricts our federal and central government must be strictly interpreted. Any loose interpretation of this document enables the central government to expand their powers and take control of things that the Democratic Republicans would believe would be best addressed on the state level. And now that we know what general system of government we want, we know what we're trying to avoid, and we know a means by which we're using our Constitution, because we are a constitutional republic, we need to use our Constitution to govern. The way we're going to use our Constitution to protect this idea. Now, what else do you have to think about when you talk about a government, a state at large? The economy. How should the government interact with the economy? Well, the Democratic Republicans adamantly believed we need to have a laissez-faire approach to the economy. Free market capitalism, hands off. They're strong defenders of the sentiments of Adam Smith, and that the invisible hand will regulate the economy without the government interfering at all. So what the government should do is simply step back and let the natural mechanisms of the economy and markets operate independently. So we know the general system we want. We know why we want it. We know how we're going to use our government's documents to protect the system, how we're going to interact with the economy. Now, pretty much when oversimplifying governance, what's the last thing you need? Well, you do exist on a globe, right? What are our foreign policies going to look like? Well, the Democratic Republicans are known as Francophiles. Remember, France is going through a similar revolution, and they held similar sentiments with those French revolutionists. We have a sister nation over the Great Sea that is going through the same state and global experiment that we are. Those are our ideal allies as we both craft our new systems of government. We do see, so we understand this is a political party here, Democratic, Republicans, all aligning under these 5 policy positions. We see even individuals like James Madison, a writer of the Federalist Papers, eventually transitioning to identify with the Democratic Republicans, aligning with Thomas Jefferson, and actually contributing to the formation of this political party in the 1790s. But let's bounce back and look at the political party that James Madison helped create, the Federalist Party. We're going to remember the Federalist Party under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton. He did not take any significant, he was never the president or vice president. He was Secretary of State for a brief period. So he did have significant positions within the federal government. And we're going to see him as the hardline defender of the most extreme versions of Federalist policy at this point in U.S. history. Remember, secretly wanting a unitary system of government, Alexander Hamilton did, exclusively Alexander Hamilton, when we look at the primary founding fathers that we're examining, although there were many that shared his sentiment. So, what is the Federalist Party now that they're contributing to a political party system? Well, they don't just want the ratification of the Constitution anymore. Now they want a strong central government to unite the states and maintain this ratified Constitution. So, maintaining a lot of the same generalized sentiments about general beliefs of government as the Federalists did prior. I mean, it is a lot of times the same party, same collective, although before there wasn't a political party. This is now the developed party. James Madison has left the collective, and we see the Federalist Party take shape under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton. So we know what their general beliefs were. Why did they believe that we needed a strong central government? Well, they did this because they were very fearful of anarchy and mob rule. In Federalist Paper number 10, you'll see some of the sentiments identifying the detriments that could come with mob rule. Anarchy, of course, is the complete lack of any existence of government within a society. So we see they were very, very fearful of no government or a excessively weak government like what occurred at Shays' Rebellion years prior, or a mob rule society in which we are a government ruled based on the whims and emotions of the moment, which, as we know, ebb and flow and can be quite abrasive. So we know what general system of government they wanted. We know why they wanted it and what fears they were driving them to have this general belief in governance. Now we also have to understand how they interpreted our Constitution that was just ratified when it comes to this new system of government, this centralized, strong government. Well, they believed it's important to have a living and breathing Constitution. They were hoping to have loose interpretations of our Constitution with the aim of understanding that, well, the Constitution restricts this government. As this government expands its responsibilities, its avenues of providing security to the people, we need to be able to have this document breathe and live for each generation. This is not a document that was perfectly written. Remember Benjamin Franklin, his closing remarks, that he even stated before the ratification of the Constitution that this document is nowhere near perfect, but it could be worse. That's a misrepresentation of it. But generally stating, it is the detriments of this document that we will improve upon over the years instead of the benefits that we will rely upon over the years. So they wanted a document and Constitution that could be developed with each generation. So they loosely interpreted our Constitution. Now we understand what system they wanted, what they were fearful of, and why they wanted that, how they're going to use this Constitution in our constitutional republic to protect this aim that they have of a strong federal government. And now we have to think about the economy. How should this government interact with the economy? Well, it makes sense if you think about their general beliefs. They want this government to engage with the economy. They want this government to think about how to strengthen the state at large by strengthening the state's markets and economy. So they align with protectionist policies. Think of tariffs and subsidies, building up what you may remember from high school as infant industries to be able to compete on the international stage. So we needed to have state intervention. State needed to enact tariffs on foreign nations and subsidize domestic industries so we can build them up and get to a point where we could compete. Because remember, other nations globally had established textile mills, established manufacturing industries that were operating for hundreds of years. And we came into the picture, maybe not hundreds of years, but they were successfully operating with the foundations already established. Definitely not hundreds of years. While the United States had to build up those industries from scratch. So protectionism. They did generally win out with protectionist strategies when it comes to economic intervention in early American history, although of course this has ebbed and flowed throughout US history significantly. And now that we know the general system, why we want it because of the fears of the collective, how we're going to use our Constitution to defend the system, what we're going to do with our economy, now what are we going to do about our foreign policy? Well, the Federalists are Anglophiles. You could think of it as, I like to oversimplify this and view them almost as the realists. Think about the time that we just led the American Revolution. Who did we revolt against? Great Britain. Who was the leading military, the leading power globally at the time? France was also going through a revolution. Remember, Britain had clear dominance over, they had clear hegemony over the global economy, international stage of politics. They were the clear economic and political leader in the globe. So it is only rational to align with the strongest individual, so the strongest state, and have benefit from trade policies aligning with them and other actions of that nature. So we have two clear divides, a clear political party system. The Jeffersonian Republicans, also known as the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, and the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton. He can run Broadway, but he's not cool enough to name his own political party after him. I think I'm funny sometimes. So, why do these two collectives constitute the first political party system in the United States? Well, first, they established the precedent that representatives will campaign for the office of the president. Over the next few elections, we see the gradual formation of political party lines and the campaigning for primary candidates within each political party. Campaigns that do not look like what we see today, but gradually helped shape what we see today. We see, second, partisanship finally entered the executive branch. John Adams became the second president of the United States and openly and adamantly aligned with the Federalist Collective, creating a partisan line within the presidency that was never to be broken again throughout US history. And finally, we see that both collectives had consistent policy agendas. Those 5 points that I identified for each collectives, well, we see consistent alignment within those points that did not exist prior when there was just the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, as each collective had a wide range of policy beliefs held by each individual representative. So we see the formation of the first political party system in the United States, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, because they campaigned for the presidency. The president is now a partisan representative, and there are clear, consistent policy agendas within each collective. So let's look at two specific elections to better understand these two political parties and how they came to be. Also, how these systems that we implemented during our Constitutional Convention developed quickly after the Constitution. So, the election of 1796. Let me paint the picture for you real quick, a little review. This is our second true election within the United States of America after the Constitution has been ratified. George Washington has served 2 terms as president, 2 4-year terms. Our Constitution allows any president to serve an unlimited amount of 4-year terms. Well, old Georgie, set the precedent and stepped down after serving 2 terms. Now we have to determine, after one individual representing our executive branch for the entirety of U.S. history, who will step in? How will this represent the executive branch in the future? Well, in this campaign, we see 2 precedents set. One, which I just mentioned, through George Washington having 2 terms and then stepping down, establishing a 2-term limit only to be challenged once, hopefully, in U.S. history. And we see established campaigning for the presidency along loose party lines. Now, after this election, a little bit after the 1800 election, but this election was the first spark that revealed there are some faults in our electoral system, as we saw the incentivization for the creation of the 12th Amendment, which changed how we elect the president. Now, why did we see the incentivization for the creation of the 12th Amendment? Well, because we had a unique result in this election. Remember, this is early America. Forget everything you know about how we elect the president. At this time, we had a collective of individuals who were, maybe they didn't desire to be president as much as other representatives saw them as good candidates, so they would propose them. And these individuals would then have a vote among the Electoral College, as that was already created at the time. Now, when you look at the Electoral College votes, the final vote for president looks something like this. John Adams obtaining 71 votes. Thomas Jefferson obtaining 68 votes. Thomas Pinckney obtaining 59. Aaron Burr, 30. Samuel Adams, hey, he's in the picture again, 15 votes. Oliver Ellsworth, don't know who that is, 11 votes. George Clinton, 7. John Jay, our first Supreme Court Justice, 5. James Iredell, 3. George Washington, he's not even running. He doesn't want the office, but he still got 2 votes. John Henry and Samuel Johnston, both getting 2 votes. And Charles C. Pinckney getting 1 vote. You know, poor Pinckneys. They had that agreement at the Constitutional Convention and then really nothing after. Although you see their name pop up here and there. So after I just listed how many votes they all got, well, how did we end up having the president be John Adams, the leading vote getter, but the vice president being Thomas Jefferson, a representative of the opposite viewpoint, the second most vote getter? Well, at the time, prior to the 12th Amendment, the individual who got the most votes for president, of course, became the president. But the runner-up, the individual who got the second most votes, became the vice president. If we had that system present in today's politics, we would currently have a presidency of Donald Trump with the vice president being Kamala Harris, or previously Joe Biden with the vice president being Donald Trump, or etc. We would have had a Obama Mitt Romney presidency. We would have had a Hillary Clinton Donald Trump presidency, as they would have both shared the presidencies together, as they were the top 2 vote getters for the office of the president. Now, we realized that was a detriment because we basically had a scenario where Donald Trump and Kamala Harris had to be president and vice president, as we had John Adams, a leading Federalist, obtain the presidency, with Thomas Jefferson, a leading Democratic Republican, being the vice president. In this election, we see 7 states allowed popular vote out of 13, with only 2.07% of the general population voting. An interesting detail worth mentioning that helps exemplify that among our founding fathers, we were best defined as a constitutional republic over a democracy, although representative democracy is the term political scientists use in contemporary politics. So, without spending too much time on it, election of 1796, we see there were 2 primary policy issues that led to John Adams eventually being able to win the presidency. We see these issues being the Jay Treaty, which was a treaty aligning with Britain after the Revolution to identify trade policies and practices to get some British troops out of the Western United States and just really work out the policy positions after the Revolution in a more positive framing that allowed for Britain to get some help remedying their leave, while the United States got some positive trade lines through Great Britain and their other colonies. So we see this was strongly opposed by the general public and actually led to John Jay having very not positive protests against him in the streets, with fires of I have the weird word, effigies or whatever it is, images of him. And this was, although beneficial to the state over time, not a positive move by the general public. We also see the conflict, the discussion and debate around the federal bank, as the federal bank was created years prior, led by Alexander Hamilton. Thank you, boy on Broadway, as he aimed to collect all of these state debts that were incurred during the American Revolution, unify them within a single central bank, so it's a central authority responsible for all the debt obtained by the individual states, and which eventually led to the strengthening of the central government, the creation of the federal bank that we have today, which acts independently from the central government, as we realized it was an excessive power given to our central government, which was a sentiment advocated for by the Democratic Republicans, and eventually was close to resulting in a loss of the election by John Adams, as he was a defender of Alexander Hamilton and the federal bank. But we see the conclusion of the 1796 election. John Adams is our president, and his political opponent, Thomas Jefferson, is now the vice president, creating a period in which the presidency is working to undermine the role of vice presidency for years to come. Now, let's talk about those years to come. 4 years later, we have once again another election. John Adams aims to be reelected President of the United States. But after those two conflicts, the XYZ affair and Alien and Sedition Act, which wasn't referenced in politics until recent years, and we see the general public was among the representatives as well, not a fan of John Adams' leadership, citing that he was overly concentrating power within the central government and leading us in a direction of the monarchs. So we have a little pushback against John Adams. And the best form of protest in the United States, even from the beginning, is evident through the distribution in the Electoral College. So 1800 election comes in, and how are the votes distributed? Well, Thomas Jefferson has 73 Electoral College votes, but wait, Aaron Burr, the individual, if you listen to the Hamilton play, who shot and killed Hamilton, he also has 73 Electoral College votes. John Adams has 65 Electoral College votes. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney has 64 Electoral College votes. And our boy John Jay, although defeated by the Jay Treaty and the public outcry against him, still is able to obtain 1 Electoral College vote. Remember, John Jay, first Supreme Court Justice. I'll keep yelling that at you. So, what do we do when there's a perfect tie within the Electoral College? John Adams, he seems to be out. 65 votes to the 73 to Aaron Burr and Jefferson. Unlikely he'll catch up. But we see there's a tie between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. So the system in place said this then goes to the House of Representatives for a contingent election. The first time they voted, in which this system requires state total votes, and you need 9 votes, a supermajority, to win the election. Thomas Jefferson only obtained 8 state delegation votes, while Aaron Burr obtained 6. We see a recounting of the vote over and over, a recasting of ballots. 7 days later, we see the final and 36th attempt at casting the vote within the House of Representatives, in which, after 35 deadlocked ballots, the House finally broke the tie in the 36th round, with Thomas Jefferson obtaining 10 states and Aaron Burr obtaining only 4. Thomas Jefferson is to be the next president of the United States, and Aaron Burr is to be his vice president. So, why is this important? Well, for one, we note that the system in place through our Constitution resulted in countless ties and political opponents having to share the same office. 2 notable conflicts evident in the last 2 elections that reveal a detriment to this electoral system and incentivize the creation of the 12th Amendment, which we'll look at in just a slide or 2. So we see opposing viewpoints in the same office and a long, tedious electoral process. We also see the formation and establishment of 2 political parties, John Adams, Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. And one final interesting point. John Adams passing the Alien and Sedition Act, becoming very unliked by the general populace, and Thomas Jefferson, his political rival, coming in to take leadership, and also usher in a period of oppositional policy positions and governance than what John Adams represented in his leadership. It's also worth noting this is the second and third president of the United States, a period in which it is unclear the practices that we maintain when we transition office. It is unclear that we will even have peaceful transitions of power between parties because states globally were not. Many nations during similar comparable periods resulted in blood being spent in the streets, leaders being hung and beheaded, and instead, John Adams gave absolute power and leadership to his political rival, Thomas Jefferson. And we have established the precedent of peaceful transitions of power between parties and between presidents, regardless of the conflict of policy. So, in 1796, two opposite leaders take the executive. 1800, oh, this is a slow process to finally determine who the president is. A few years later, we have the implementation of the 12th Amendment, one of the first amendments to our United States Constitution. This amendment changed the way the president and vice president are to be elected. And if there is a tie, it specified the House of Representatives will vote for the president. So, how is there a change? Well, it shifted to what we see today. Instead of the second runner-up for president becoming the vice president, we see the president and vice president are elected on two distinct ballots. We will vote for president and we will cast a separate vote for vice president. Not exactly as we see it today, where there is the running mates, but we see finally the distinction between the two bodies. And now, the one individual running for president cannot become the vice president. In this amendment, we read, quote, "The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president and distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president," end quote, even specifying how the vote should be counted by the president of the Senate, which actually brought a great moment as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, as they were vice presidents, also acting as the president of the Senate. We'll make sure we learn that later on, were counting their own votes, which resulted in them obtaining the presidency. So, and it also represents how so few votes were being cast at the time. 2% of the general population was voting. We had electoral college votes that were able to be counted by one individual at the head of the Senate. So what we've talked about today is really the first experience of political parties evolving. Their evolution from two sides of a simple disagreement about the ratification of our Constitution, eventually becoming two political parties which would evolve, disband, but represent the two-party system that would persist throughout all of U.S. history. So when we look at this evolution and development of political parties over time, we got to have some key terms to describe the shifts that occur. So for one, let's make sure we understand. Party identification is the focus of this slide. It's one's alignment with a political party. Your party identification, of course, can change at any given moment in your life if you choose to have that be. So when we look at the possible change of party identification, which occurred within the Anti-Federalists, as they didn't have party identification clearly, and then eventually identified with the Democratic Republicans, we see two processes: party de-alignment and party realignment. Party realignment is when a substantial number of voters, think of this happening by the voters. The voters have control here. A substantial number of voters switch party allegiance and produce long-term change in the political landscape. In the 1960s, there were many Democrats who were pro-segregation policies in the South, known as the Dixiecrat Democrats. After a period of party realignment, they left the Democratic Party and aligned with the Republican Party, creating a period of change within the policies of the two parties, which was led by the voters, large number of voters, which created a clearer party line along certain issues, specifically in the 1960s segregation policies. Of course, that only lasted about a decade or two. Pro-segregationist policies and sentiments are not aligned within the Republican Party at all anymore, and I will not make that argument, although we do see the long-lasting change in the political landscape persisting from that party realignment period, as you see Republican southern states that were Democratic at the time shifted to Republican along that specific policy issue. So we also see party de-alignment, which is when a substantial number of voters, remember, bottom up impact here, is when a substantial number of voters do not identify with any of the primary political parties and they detach from the two-party political system. You'll often see this being occurring during, seeing this represented by a period in which a third-party candidate gets a significant number of votes, and which we'll talk about later on in the course, as we have three significant third-party candidates. George Wallace, Theodore Roosevelt, and Ross Perot, who garnered at least 10% of the popular vote, which brought significant shifts to the party identification and landscape of the United States. And if this was an in-person class, I would ask, since we do see, according to Gallup poll data and Pew Research, that there is a rise in individuals identifying as independents, and I would ask, if this signals a period of party de-alignment or realignment in the United States, and do you have any predictions about what the future may hold in regards to how political parties may evolve? But since I'm talking to technology, I'll let that one sit on the back burner. So what do we learn? Well, pause the screen, ask yourself these questions, see if you can answer them. Were these your answers? Hopefully so. Again, just pause it and make sure you can study this, take clear notes, and understand that these are what's expected of you when it comes to what I'll ask on the quiz. What's due this week? Remember, you got the discussions. All you have to do this week is follow up with a single response to one of your classmates' questions. If you had 5 people ask you questions, pick your favorite. You only have to respond to one. You don't have to respond to every single one. Your essay topic selection assignment is due this Sunday. Pick your essay topic. There are a couple prompts provided to you that you can pick from, but you can pick your own essay as long as you tell me what it is, how you're going to write it, the structure of your paper, and why it's relevant to American government. And you basically send me your pitch. You have to get my final approval before you start writing your paper or your midterm, but you do have to submit some form of a document or proposal by the end of this week. All right, y'all. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble on. I love this stuff. I think it's fascinating, and it tells you a lot about human nature and our history. And when you really look at this period in American history, it's inspiring. It's beautiful storytelling. It's a story of compromise and accommodation, of leadership, strong-willed individuals who became the leaders of our nation and then turned around and said, my opinion is not the only opinion to be respected. It's beautiful stuff, my people. All right. Thank you for listening to me. I'll talk to you guys next week. And hopefully over email. If you got questions or want to ramble or talk about history or geek out over some random stuff or talk cats or basketball, let's do it. Talk to y'all soon.